All right, here for part two of our videos on the Nebraska Social Studies Standards. And so grateful to Mark Brady of ESU 7 for joining me, Andrew Easton of the ESU CC, for another, I'll just say an extension of that conversation. And so if you didn't get a chance to watch part one, make sure you go look at that portion before delving into what we have to learn from Mark from this piece. And so that being said, here we go, Nebraska Social Studies Standards Overview, part two.
Absolutely. So we talked in the previous video about the standards, how they're laid out, some important considerations as you're looking at your grade level standards for those who maybe haven't had a lot of exposure to them to this point. In this video, as Andrew said, we're going to talk about the shifts. And we talk about the impact of the instructional shifts. We're really talking about the how. So we see the what within the standards. That's related to what we're teaching the students, what they're interacting with, what they're learning about. The shift is really how are we having students interact with those things? How are we introducing that? How are we facilitating that as teachers? And I think it's really helpful in that regard. Yeah, Andrew.
So my question is going to be then, so would you qualify that the pieces in color, the history, civics, economics, geography, are that what that you were referencing, and the how might be in the circle that encompasses those?
Absolutely. And you're going to see some of the how, some of the outer circle there within the standards. You know, there's going to be standards that have students formulate their own questions, but definitely like that outer circle, those are the communicating, questioning, applying, evaluating. That is related to the how. That's how we want students interacting with the content, and we as teachers being intentional with thinking about what that looks like in the classroom for sure. It's a great question. Yeah. So we're going to talk about these words shifts here. When you hear the word shift, Andrew, what comes to your mind?
Gosh, well, aside from driving down the road in a manual or like automatic stick shift, I would say this is like a pivot maybe, or this is a well, I'll get back to that car reference. A transition potentially is what I think of when I think of shifting and shifting gears.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good picture. And shifting a gear in a car is very similar to what I think of as well. We think about it in terms of a noun. It's slight. You mentioned the word slight there, change in position, direction, or tendency. Or in verb form is really to change maybe the emphasis or the direction or the focus. So hopefully this is not a noticeable. It's not like a jolting shift, but it is a little bit of a change in perhaps how social studies instruction was approached in the past. And we talk about shifts, again, we're talking about the how. So there is a little bit of a change in these standards regarding how we want to be teaching our social studies classes, guiding our students as they explore these topics. And that's what we're going to talk about here in this brief video. So let's take a look at the shifts themselves. So the first one, I'm just going to put them up on the screen here. The first one is inquiry. And really, this is like an umbrella shift. I feel like a lot of the other shifts can fit under this one of inquiry. We'll talk about that more here in a bit. We have application of disciplinary lenses, evaluation of sources, use of evidence, communication of conclusions, inclusion of multiple perspectives, emphasis on K-12 scope and sequence, strong civics connections, and then unbanding of 6, 7, and 8. And we'll talk about these more in really two categories here. So statewide, as we were having discussion around these instructional shifts, the how, we kind of grouped them into two categories. We said on the left side here, these are more structural. These are more like really the structure of the standards themselves. So in the previous video, we used kind of a staircase picture to show the scope and sequence, kind of emphasizing the point that in kindergarten, the focus is on themselves. And then as we progress through different grade levels, that focus kind of moves further and further away from themselves, or at least talks about how do you kind of relate to people who live in communities that might be far away from yours or across the globe. What does that look like? So that's really emphasizing the scope and sequence. Another structural piece is unbanding of 6, 7, and 8. So in our previous version of the standards in 2012, there was just a 6-8 band of standards, and schools kind of had the freedom to decide at what grade levels were they going to teach the specific standards. In the 2019 version, we have specific 6th grade standards, specific 7th grade standards, and specific 8th grade standards to be taught at each of those specific grade levels. So that's definitely a change kind of structurally. And then throughout, there's just a strong connection to civics and civic readiness, throughout the standards. So those are all kind of structural pieces. On the right side, we kind of categorize these as being more teaching and learning shifts. So these are things that teachers and students are going to be kind of interacting and thinking about on a more regular basis. And so you see things like inquiry and disciplinary lenses, evaluation sources, and down the list there. These are things that we're going to be thinking about in our planning and more on a regular basis in the classroom. So I want to give a little bit of an example of what these, specifically on the right side of this previous slide here, these teaching and learning shifts, what might that look like? And so we think about inquiry, we're thinking about having students kind of explore and analyze questions that may or may not have right answers, right? They're questions that, depending on the situation, depending on what you're analyzing, you might come up with different conclusions. And there are also questions that are compelling. They're questions that definitely are worthy of historical investigation. And I've given you an example of one of those questions here. So this would be like an inquiry question that we could analyze in maybe a 4th grade Nebraska history class. So did the American dream come true for families who moved to Nebraska? Again, we think about right or wrong answer to this question. It could totally depend on, what people group are we studying, and what were their circumstances like? And there's really no answer that's going to be the same across all of our studies in Nebraska history. So that's our overarching inquiry question. And then we want students to be thinking like historians, like geographers, like economists, like political scientists. That's what it means to have students, applying disciplinary lenses. Are they thinking like historians? And so some of these questions kind of get to that point. If we asked an additional question related to our overarching question, that might be something like, why did these families move to Nebraska? Well, we might put on kind of our geographer lens and say, what about Nebraska? What's true about Nebraska that might draw people in? Maybe there's an economist lens there as well, saying, what are some features of the state that, maybe is true of our soil or true of our climate that might have economic, ramifications in terms of the types of jobs that people might have here. What kind of jobs brought people here in the first place? Another question might be, what was life like for them? That's kind of through the lens of historian. What did their day-to-day life look like when families first moved to Nebraska? What were their experiences like? And then even thinking through a geographer's lens as well as, these first families that moved to our state, what are some of the lasting cultural impacts, did they make on our state that maybe are still evident today in 2022? So we talk about application of disciplinary lenses. It's just getting students to think like historians, geographers, economists, political scientists would think through the use of some of these questions. And again, in that process, we want students to be evaluating sources and looking at sources from different perspectives. So for example, if we're talking about families and what their experiences were like coming to Nebraska, we might be looking at different perspectives of that. How might that have been true for a certain group of people, and how might it have been different for a different group of people? Looking at sources that give us evidence of that, highlighting differing perspectives. And then as our students are studying those sources and as they're looking for multiple perspectives, they're thinking in these ways, how can we get them to communicate what they're learning and support some of the claims that they're making? Getting to using evidence, communicating their conclusions. Those are all pieces of these instructional shifts and the ways that we want students to be active in the social studies classroom as well. So what I'd like for you to do now, you have access to the Social Studies Standards document. I'd like for you to go back to your grade level standards, and I want you to see where these shifts show up in your grade level. Where do you see pieces of inquiry? Where do you see students thinking through these disciplinary lenses, evaluating sources, maybe communicating conclusions and supporting those? Where do you see those show up in your grade level standards? And these shifts are K-12 shifts. So regardless of whether you teach kindergarten or whether you teach high school seniors, you're going to see these pieces show up in our state social studies standards. All right, so in this brief video, we talked about the impact of the instructional shifts. Encourage you to dig in and take a look at where those shifts show up in your grade level standards.
Yeah, and if you'd like a little bit more on those shifts, we have a statewide podcast, the Good Life EDU podcast, where a particular conversation that we're pointing to here captures some dialogue around those shifts. And really, I think, to kind of get back to what you were just saying there a moment ago, Mark, that inquiry model is a deviation from the what some of us might refer to as sage on the stage approach to relaying events from history through direct instruction primarily or only. And so finding ways to have students explore more in all the ways that you've talked about in this video and the previous one. And that conversation is captured there should you want some further learning on it. And that brings us to our close. And so, Mark, I just want to say thank you so much for your time, effort, energy in putting this slide deck together, for your advocacy and sharing out on this topic. And so feel free to share this video with others that might benefit from it. And always feel free to reach out to your local ESU for support on social studies or any content area for that matter, as it is our mission to serve. So thanks, and going to bring this to a close.
All right. Excellent. Thanks, Andrew.